This video will walk you through making a cob or a cutout background. We tend to use the word cob in place of cutout background because it's just kind of a shortcut for talking about this technique that we use quite a bit in both graphic design and journalism. There are a bunch of ways to make cutout backgrounds. The way I'm going to show you is the way that I think works the best most of the time. There are exceptions, and I'll walk you through some of those as well, but most of the time I tend to like the way this works for a cutout background. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start with this picture of this adorable dog, and we're going to cut out around him using the pen tool. So I'm going to come over to the pen tool. I have this, first of all, we have this image open in Photoshop. Photoshop is the place to work with pictures. Don't do this in Illustrator, it won't work. Photoshop is the place to do this. So I'm going to start out with the pen tool here. And it's going to work, for those of you who have experience in Illustrator, it's going to work a lot, really similarly to the way it would in Illustrator. Now, to get a nice clean cut around something, I like to zoom in really, really close. So let's go ahead and just start right here on his nose. And I'm going to click and then pull out this little anchor point. I have some great instructions in the rim for doing this as well, so you can kind of look at it there. But every time I click and I leave this little directional point, I'm going to leave that directional point along the point that I want my next line to be. So I'm clicking, and then I'm going to reset this second directional point by holding down the Alt key, because I'm going to get this curve around the nose. Okay, so I'm going to click, and then I'm going to hold down the Alt key to set this next directional point. Okay, click. I'm going to set that next directional point, holding down the Alt key. Okay, click. I get my first point set right, and I'm going to hold down the Alt key to reset that second directional point. Okay. Now notice I'm not just clicking 1,000 times, because I don't want it to be really jaggedy. I want to get like a nice curve. So I'm click, I'll hold down the Alt key to set this directional point. Okay. Now if at some point I get this off, right, I'm not super happy with that. I just hit Control Z to go back. So I'm going to click, set this point where I want it to be. I'll hold down Alt to swing this one up. Now this goes off the page right here. Occasionally that happens, so I'm just going to set a straight point. I'm not even going to draw out the directional point. Okay, so I'm just clicking and letting go. So I'm going to click now, set that first point the way I want it to be, and I'm going to pull this other directional point over here so I can get around his fur. Click. Okay, set this directional point. Okay, I think you're getting a feel for it. I'm going to move through the rest of going around him and kind of fast forward at this point. Okay, we've made it all the way around our dog with this path. You can see that, like, when I got over to here, I ended up deciding to leave this whole blanket in. And the reason being that if I didn't, this foot was going to look really oddly cut off. And so I just decided to leave that blanket in. Sometimes you have to make those decisions. This is pretty good, but I have a couple little areas I need to clean up. So which is actually kind of perfect for what we're talking about. So let's talk about that. I'm going to go over to my Paths panel now. I'm going to right click on that path, and I'm going to say make selection. It's going to ask me if I want to feather it. I'm not going to worry about that now because we'll work on that in a minute here. But you can see I've got this nice selection of my path, but I kind of cut off some parts here, and so I want to fix that. So we're going to use quick mask mode. So I'm going to click on this little button down here. That's our quick mask button, and it's showing me what's selected and what's not. And so what I want to do is I want to add this little portion back in. And we're going to do that using the brush tool. And at this point, I can decide to either make this a hard brush or a soft brush. I'm going to go with kind of a harder brush. Every time I add, to make this brush, a couple little shortcuts. To make this brush larger or smaller, I can use these, the bracket keys. So if I go with the left bracket, it makes it smaller, just like that. If I go with the right bracket, it makes it bigger, but I can adjust that. And sometimes you're adjusting it as you go because you might want it smaller sometimes and bigger other times. The other thing to keep in mind is if I want to add to that red selection, the black will be on top there. And if I want to take away from it, I can either click on that or hit X on my keyboard, and it will bring that back. So sometimes you can kind of begin to really tweak what you've done. So here we go. We're going to make this brush a little bit smaller, And I'm going to start to just kind of adjust my selection. I hit X to add that little bit back in. And the closer in I get, the more I can see what I'm doing. Whoop. And we'll just kind of start to take some of that away. Depending on your selection, you may want it really feathered. If I do it really feathered, then I can actually kind of make for a really soft edge, but we're gonna feather the edge of this in just a slightly different way. So I'm gonna get that in nice and close there. I love this particular tool. If I have someone who has like curly hair and I wanna make sure I get those little wisp of hair, I love doing the quick mask to get those little wisp of hair. So for example, he's got all these like little, this is probably not the biggest way I've used it, but say I wanted to really capture this little wisp of hair. I'm gonna make my brush really small, and we're gonna just kind of draw those little wispies in, okay? Sometimes probably when I would do this, I might use more of a brush that has kind of a softer edge, because that would really like lend itself to some of that softness around the edge of those wispies. And I'm gonna make my brush a little bigger here and just really soften up some of these edges. Because I feel like, you know, this, especially around the top of him, is just a really kind of soft edge. So we're just gonna play into that a little bit. And you can kind of see it, it even looks a little bit softer. Okay. That gives you an idea of how that works. Okay. Now, I'm going to really look at the selection. Whoop. I'm going to really look at the selection again. Once I have this fixed, I'm going to go back to click that quick mask mode button again, and now I can really see it. I can see if there's, you know, I feel like I'm losing just a little bit of his eye here, so I'm going to go back into that quick mask mode, and I'm going to just kind of add some more of that back in. I went too far. Great. Okay. That feels better to me. Now, we're going to refine our edge on our selection. So we're going to go select, refine edge. And this is going to give us an idea of what this would look like if we actually cut it out like this. And what I want to do, you can adjust any of these little settings here. Don't go crazy, okay? But I'm going to feather it just a little bit. Not too much, but just enough so that it doesn't look like such a hard edge. I'll say okay. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this particular selection on its own layer. So I'm going to say Control J. Okay, and now I can turn off this background layer using my eyeball here. And that looks pretty good to me. I'm really liking that. Now, there's another way you can do this. You can, instead of putting it on its own layer, you can actually mask it within that Layers panel by hitting that Add Vector Mask button. Sometimes that's the way we want to do it. A lot of times, for our purposes, it works just as well to hit Control J and put that on its own layer. Now, the reason we do that and we don't just hit delete is so that we have our original layer below. Because you really want to, like, if something gets messed up and we need to fix that, we really want to be able to go back to that original layer and look at it. Now, at this point, sometimes you have little extra spaces that you need to cut out. That isn't the case in this particular shape, but if I needed to cut out if I did need to cut out a little space again, I would just cut out that little portion that I needed to do and just, you know, make that selection, then hit delete to cut it out on this layer. But we don't need to do that on this particular picture, so we're just going to go ahead and save this where we're at. This is a nice clean cut. On Cobb's, we're going to save, and oops, let's go back to our folder. You'll want to save it for graphic design. You'll want to make sure you save these into your class folders. For yearbook or newspaper, save it into the correct page folder where we're going to be using this document later on. So I'm going to save this as something that will make sense. Dog cutout. Okay. If it's for newspaper, you know, put the issue number in that in that saving. If it's for yearbook, put the page numbers on that too. But we're we're going to do with this simple title here. I'm going to save it under a Photoshop document format because that will hold the transparency that we need. And I'll hit save. Transparency as well as the layers that we need. And that's a pretty clean way to do a cutout background. Again, I know there are lots of other ways to do cuts, and occasionally those ways work better. This one is a pretty consistent way that works well for us to do cuts.